Well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home to the most touchable warbirds in Texas. I'm Jim Hodson. I'm the executive director here, and behind the camera today, we've got Gary Goff again.
Howdy.
Today, we're going to talk about a subject that most people are very unfamiliar with, but to me is one of the most important aspects of early aviation in terms of development of commercial aviation and aviation in general here in North Texas. We're going to talk about airmail. We've got an entire side of the museum here that actually talks about airmail, and one of the reasons we're going to talk about it today is because on May 12th of 1926, the first airmail to leave Texas took place out of here, right here at Meacham Field. An airplane which was called, get a picture of this one. You got that?
Got it.
It is a Curtiss carrier pigeon.
Pigeon.
Yeah, and this one was called Miss Fort Worth. This is the actual day that this took place. It was a big deal. So National Air Transport was the first commercial airline to do cross-country flights here. Now, when we think about cross-country, we think about getting in an airplane in New York and flying cross-country and landing. That's not exactly the way National Air Transport did it. They would start on the East Coast, and they'd fly all day, and then they would land, and then you'd get on a train, and you'd ride the train all night, and you'd get up in the morning in a new place, get on an airplane, you'd fly all day, you'd land someplace, you'd get off of the airplane, get on a train, you'd ride the train all night until the next day when you'd get up and get on an airplane and manage to get yourself to the West Coast. So it was a series of flights and train rides that were cross country, but National Air Transport was the first airline to do successful transcontinental flights. Well, now the airmail flight out of here took place, and it went from here in Fort Worth, it went to Kansas City, it went to Wichita, it went to St. Louis, it went to some other place, and then finally got to Chicago. Now, when they did commercial service, they referred to it as breakfast in Fort Worth and dinner in Chicago. But this is where the mail routes came in, and mail is what really spurred commercial aviation before we got into a lot of passenger service. But we're going to roll this back and go back to the point of where airmail actually started, which was in about 1910, actually. Aviation was just starting up, or it was starting to take hold, and actually a Texas congressman proposed in the U.S. Congress that we start to develop an airmail service, but they were going to use airships to do it. It failed, but at least it got people starting to think about that. So the next year in 1911, Earl Ovington became the first pilot to fly airmail, and he flew a letter from Washington, D.C. to New York. And that was the first airmail service that took place. Now consider 1911, there weren't a lot of airfields. In fact, there were virtually none. So he flew out of a park in Washington, D.C., which is along the Potomac near where National Airport is right now. He flew out of that place and then flew into one of the racetracks in New York City. I think it was the Belmont, but he flew into there and landed, and that's where he delivered the mail. Now the mail at first started to go just between Washington and New York. And for a lot of the airmail delivery, it was simply taking air and flying over a location and dropping a bag out of the airplane. So it started to expand somewhat. The Postal Service started to expand somewhat, and it started going to places like Philadelphia. So it would go from New York to Philadelphia, or Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, and they decided that they wanted to go further and further west. Eventually, what the plan was to try to get airmail service to go all the way to the West Coast. But there was a big challenge. And the challenge was, if you couldn't fly it cross-country faster than a train could do it, then there was no reason to do airmail. So it was a great competition that took place. Now, what it started out with, when the airmail started flying at first, they used the military. They used the Army Air Corps. Now, that's a Jenny, and it's a truck. So the truck would show up, give them a bag of mail, and the pilots would put it in the airplane, and they would fly it. Now, this is in 1918. This is towards the end of the war, 1917, 1918. And who's in charge of the Army Air Corps aviation at that point in time? Our friend Benjamin Falloy. So Gary can can roll it around there so we can see good old Benny Falloy here. Here's Benny. Benjamin Falloy, who was head of the Air Force, the Army Air Corps at that time. So as the war started to wind down and people were coming back, pilots wanted to continue flying airplanes, and so that's why the U.S. Postal Service decided to use pilots for a while, because they were plentiful and the airplanes were there. So they started doing flights and going further and further west. They would go to Chicago. Now, at this point in time, there were no radios, essentially. There were no nav aids. So the pilots managed to navigate by doing what we would call now in the military strip charts. I know Gary's flown with those. I've flown with those, especially low-level navigation where you're not using electronic mail or electronics. You're using a knee board or a map or that kind of thing. So there's some fabulous old maps that the pilots had made that were hand drawn that would say you follow the river so far to a big rock or to a hill, and then you turn left and to a certain heading, and then you go here or there, and that would get you to where you needed to go to drop off the mail. In many cases, they would have problems with mechanical problems, or they would get lost and they would land in a field and go ask the farmer, "Where am I?" and then get back in the airplane and continue it. So this whole process of development of airmail in the early 1920s is really pretty fascinating. And a quick aside here, if you're ever in Washington, D.C., there's a postal museum that's right near the Capitol building. And they have one of the best exhibits of airmail that you'll ever see. They've got all of the old airplanes that were used and the towers and some of the other things we're going to talk about. So we're trying to get this airmail to go across the country. So this is the first challenge. Get it across country, make it so that it's more capable than the railroad trains. And so they had to do this in a lot of different fashions. So one of the things was they had to have these routes, and they were only flying about 200 miles per route, where the pilots would fly and land, and they would either hand the mail off, kind of like the Pony Express, or they would continue to keep going. And so the original routes went from the East Coast and went across through Montana and Utah to San Francisco. Now, this is what the whole airmail route looked like in 1928. So they were doing the East Coast all the way to the West Coast here. I got that right?
So they're going from they're up in the Midwest. They're not down here at all.
No, they're not going down south. Number one, they weren't going to go south, going east and west, because they didn't want to have to deal with the Sierras. So they went up north and came down around, because the airplanes aren't going to fly that high. So one of the things that they had to do is figure out how do they keep going and how do they fly at night. Night flying was one of the big deals, because eventually that was the only way they were going to beat the trains, is to be able to fly the mail at night. Because the trains were moving at night, the trains were moving in the daytime. So they had to be able to beat that. So what they came up with after the First World War was a series of, and I know people have seen these,
so cool.
Seen these on Google. You can find these all over the internet. It's the big concrete arrows in the little shacks, and the arrows would point people in the directions they wanted to go. Inside the shack is an engine, a car engine, that would keep a light going on top. Some of them had gas lights and that kind of thing, and they were spaced out so pilots could literally fly from light to light to light, and as they flew over the area, they could see the arrows and see which direction they were supposed to be going. Now, initially, we were talking about flying with Jennies. In this picture, what you're seeing up here is a DH-4. Much different airplane. In fact, we've got a model of one here, right down here in the corner, and it even says U.S. Airmail on it. The DH-4 was a bomber during the First World War. Probably the most successful airplane from the First World War that had a commercial capability. They took the cockpit out of the front of the airplane and made it essentially a cargo compartment so they could put bags of mail in there. You've got a big, huge engine on the airplane, and so this is what they started to use later in the 20s to be able to get mail cross-country. So that was one of the more successful airplanes initially that was being used. So eventually, they were able to beat the train. They were able to beat the train and be able to cross-country in 22 hours, and the trains were doing it in 33 hours. So
Wow.
They were able to beat it, but it was because they were flying at night. So now this mail is going, and mail is capable, and they've decided, well, it's no longer are we going to use the U.S. military, and the United States Postal Service didn't want to be in the airplane business. So what they decided to do was what we referred to as contract airmail routes. And so that's what you're seeing on this map. All these other routes that go north and south, and all of the spurs off of the east-west, these are contract airmail routes. Now, just so happens we had an individual here in North Texas that was very instrumental in this, and this was Amon Carter. Amon Carter had seen to it that Fort Worth was the center for regular mail via the trains. So this was a hub for regular mail here here in Fort Worth. Well, what he also did was he started helping airlines put together their contract airmail routes, and we've got some maps of those over here. So the contract airmail routes also went through Fort Worth, right here at Meacham Field. So what we had is the trains and the airplanes were all working through Fort Worth with the mail. So
okay, so you're saying here, like this is contract airmail route number 20.
And that's the red one. So that was American Airways' first flight on June 15th, 1931. Oh. And so that was bringing mail into and out of Fort Worth. So it was Fort Worth, Dallas, Texarkana, Little Rock, Memphis, and on. Now we've got contract airmail route number 3, National Air Transport again, May 12th, 1926. This was the first one, right?
So the purple route. Okay.
Purple route up to Chicago. So it went Dallas, Fort Worth,
south.
Oklahoma City, Wichita, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri, St. Joseph, Missouri, Moline, Illinois, and to Chicago.
Wow.
So this was linking north and south. So then you started to get into these other contract airmail routes by Southern Transcontinental Airways, by Texas Air Transport. In fact, we had a number of pilots here locally who had been World War I pilots, and after the war they got into this business. A lot of them started up little airlines like Texas Air Transport is one in particular. They flew Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, Austin, San Antonio. Eventually, and
big route. Just a big route.
Okay, and if you look over here at this, there's a gentleman named Homer Rader, and we've got a picture of him, and we've got a bunch of his material. He was the first person to fly airmail from the United States into Mexico. And he became an early pilot for American Airways. Now, this is Homer when he was just a barnstormer. There were 5 of them, him and his buddies, who were late to the war, got rifted out of the Army Air Corps and decided to want to keep flying. So they were barnstorming. They were getting jennies and things like that, and they were doing their barnstorming. Now, you'll notice here in this one letter, Gary, if you'll come back up a little bit, you'll notice that this is an airmail, and it says pilot for TAT, Charles T. Pedley. With all of the airmail, the pilots signed the airmail envelope themselves. So
that was awesome.
That was a curious thing that happened. Well, so this is what is really spurring commercial aviation development, not only here in Texas, but all throughout the United States. But now what was happening in the 1930s is that there was one person who was essentially assigning these contract airmail routes to companies. And what ended up happening is that there were 3 or 4 companies that he was giving all the contracts to. The little carriers were not getting the contracts, and essentially they were going out of business. So there was a thing that took place that was called the Great Airmail Scandal of 1933.
Scandal.
Yes, the Great Airmail Scandal of 1933. First of all, a quick step back here. How these companies were getting paid for these contracts was not how many pieces they took, but the weight of the mail that they flew.
You know, I don't think that's changed, because we're charged when we carried mail on the jets, it was by weight.
It's by weight, okay? So what was taking place...
Interesting.
So what was taking place, and I'll show you this one.
Cool.
There was a company called Varney Air Transport that eventually became Continental Airlines that was flying out of El Paso to Pueblo and stuff like that, and it was Bob 6. And so they had one of the early contract airmail routes, and so what they started to do is they had the employees mailing bricks back and forth to each other.
I love it.
So that they were getting paid to send bricks back and forth. But this is what was going on with the contracts, right? And so we had some companies that were doing all of this stuff, and the little companies started complaining, especially as they're going out of business. So they're saying, well, we need to look into this. So it was a great airmail scandal of 1934. So Roosevelt shut everything down, gave all of the airmail back to the Army Air Corps, which turned out to be really difficult because it was completely different kind of flying than it had been. This is night flying, bad weather. And in fact, Eddie Rickenbacker, who did some of that flying, referred to the airmail flying that the Army did as legalized murder. There were so many pilots who lost their life flying at night, flying in bad weather because the mail had to get through. So what took place here, and we're going to show you this, you'll notice here that on this graphic that we have, we started out with Colonial Air Transport in 24, Colonial Western Airways, Canadian Colonial, and we go all through these different airlines, right? These are all small airlines, 24, 27, 28, Missouri, Oklahoma City, Cleveland, Ohio, Kansas City, or Wichita. They started to consolidate. So these three consolidated down into Colonial Airways. This group of 6 consolidated down to Universal Aviation. And this group of 3 from Texas Air Transport, which we know a lot about here in Texas, consolidated down to Southern Air Transport. Well, they started to consolidate more and more, so these consolidated down to the Aviation Corporation, and in 1930 they become known as American Airways. Now, if you look over here, 1934 was the Great Airmail Scandal. So what we're showing is a straight line. We have American Airways and we've got American Airlines. So
different name.
So what Roosevelt came out and said is that because 4 airlines were essentially had control of all of the contracts and were doing everything, as they said, okay, no airline that has done this before can apply for the new contracts. So American Airways became American Airlines. Northwest Airways became National Airlines. Boeing Aviation Corporation became United Airlines. And Eastern Air Transport became Eastern Airways. So these companies simply changed their name and continued to get contracts. So this is how the genealogy of the aviation industry consolidated from the early 20s on the left as it consolidated down to the 1910s where we have what is left: United Airlines, Delta Airlines, American, Southwest, and then the others as they all. There's even been more consolidation since then.
Yeah, there's even been more, yeah.
And so, but this is all because of the early airmail industry and what took place with that. And so it was, we've got some pictures here of the airplanes, for instance, with airmail bags going onto the airplanes. And then in some cases it's passengers and airmail. But it's airmail that paid the freight, literally paid the freight on the airlines. And that's what made the consistent aviation going back and forth. Now, a small aside to this, I mentioned Homer Rader, who was one of the early Army Air Corps pilots in the 20s, who then, besides some of his friends, continued in the business. Homer continued on with Texas Air Transport. One of his other friends decided he had enough of flying, but wanted to stay in a single location in Austin, Texas, and just service airplanes and be able to provide gas and things like that. So he established what was one of the first fixed base operators, which we know today as FBOs. So the FBOs are still in existence today, and it's still essentially the same thing. It is a fixed base operation at a particular airport that provides communications, provides maintenance and fuel and oil and all of those kinds of things. But most of this all came out of the airmail industry and how the airmail industry developed. If it hadn't been for that commerce, transportation of passengers would have been much, much slower. Now, there are stories, for instance, of with the DH-4, which we talked about, where passengers would actually ride on the mail bags because they had to get someplace too. So they'd get in and ride on the mail bags. And then it went to things like the airplane that we're most aware of here, the Travel Air 5000, the one that's up here, that would carry some mail but would carry 4 passengers. And again, it's National Air Transport. And we talked about it. National Air Transport had this first transcontinental operation. Now, I don't know if you noticed it while Gary was showing you the genealogy, but National Air Transport became part of United Airways. So the airlines that started out and worked here out of Meacham Field, National Air Transport, Texas Air Transport, Southern Airways, then became American Airways and American Airlines, and a lot of these Delta primarily started up. They didn't carry as much mail as they did, that they were crop dusting operations in the Delta. The Mississippi Delta.
Hence Delta.
Hence Delta. So there's a lot of great stories about this stuff, about the airplanes, and I think I'm going to show you again the first airmail service here in. This is the first airmail service again here in Fort Worth. That's a Curtiss carrier pigeon. You see pictures of it. It doesn't look very big, but you can see with the people around it, it's quite a good size. And this one happened to be called Miss Fort Worth. First airmail out of Texas to go north to Chicago. So this is a fascinating story, and if you like, there's some great books out there. that talk about the airmail pilots and things they went through. They wore these huge feather outfits and things like that because it was cold. They weren't in a pressurized cockpit. And when you hear about their stories of flying at night or in snowstorms and ice storms.
How the heck did they do that?
And they had no radios. They were looking for those little lights. They were looking for the lights, and they're looking for the big arrows. And the lights were the things that got them from station to station.
Crazy.
So,
crazy.
At any rate,
it's like landing on an aircraft carrier, but different. But you guys are crazy.
Yeah. Okay. So, I wanted to spend some time on this today because this month is the 95th anniversary of the first airmail to leave the state, and Texas.
Yeah.
Texas goes back to 1910 in terms of introducing the idea of establishing airmail service, and it's one of the stories we don't talk a lot about here, but it's one of the key stories of the development of aviation, not only commercial aviation and passenger service, but commercial aviation in general. So we thought you might enjoy some of this today. I encourage you to just Google airmail or history of airmail. You're going to find out a lot of really fascinating stuff and some great personal stories about the pilots who did this stuff back in the 20s and 30s.
I can't believe they signed the letters.
Yeah, and they had to sign the letters.
They signed the letter. That is crazy. That's a lot of letters.
A total aside to this, Homer Rader, who started out doing this stuff when it became when Texas Air Transport was eventually bought up or merged into what is American Airlines by C.R. Smith. C.R. Smith was an accountant who had gone down to Texas Air Transport and looked at them and helped develop what they were doing and eventually became American Airways. Homer Rader was one of the first 10 captains for American Airlines. And there's some great stories about those guys. There's one out there that they weren't just pilots. They did a lot of other things. Homer Rader eventually got into the parking lot business in Dallas, and at one point in time later in his life, owned all of the parking in Dallas. So
yeah, a great book that I read was Fate is the Hunter, Ernie Gaughan's book. It's a fictitious story based on these guys flying around in there, and you get a real good perspective of the pilot. What is a pilot thinking as he's trying to bring this bird around? Yeah. So yeah, there's great books out there that are your imagination goes wild.
And there's some terrific stories, and when you look into it and you get a chance to see some of these hand-drawn maps that they used to be able to get themselves from place to place. I mean, they're beautifully drawn. I mean, they're almost artwork in and of themselves. And then again, if you're ever in Washington, D.C., and you're near the Capitol building, there's a big post office there, and it's the Postal Museum. And I just highly encourage you to go in because they've got some of the towers that were used to direct airplanes. Cool. They've got actual airplanes hung from the ceilings and talk about airmail. It's really fascinating. It's the only place that I know of that's like that. So if we've got any questions, be glad to answer questions today. Gary tells me that I've just totally mesmerized you and you had absolutely no questions at all.
Yeah, there's great information here. So that's great. That's what it says here. Great info.
Okay. So at any rate, from here at the Fort Worth Aviation Museum, home of the most touchable warbirds in Texas, I'm Jim Hodson with Gary Goff. And hope you have a good weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.
See ya.